The courthouse steps were cracked concrete bleeding rust stains, and Sarah Chen's worn sneakers found every uneven edge as she descended with the trembling hands clutching a deed that felt lighter than air. The paper crinkled against her chest, $400.37. That's what remained after the bank had taken everything else. The house, the car, even Tommy's college fund. Everything except this. 43 acres of Nebraska scrubland that the tax assessor had marked as, quote, agricultural wasteland, and the locals called the devil's backyard. Behind her, the heavy courthouse doors groaned shut with the finality of a coffin lid. The sound echoed across the empty plaza, where autumn wind scattered leaves like discarded lottery tickets. Sarah pulled her thin jacket tighter, feeling the October chill seep through the worn denim. Her phone buzzed. Another text from Marcus, her ex-husband, whose lawyer had been circling their assets like a vulture for months. Heard you bought some dirt pile. Classic Sarah. Always making the worst decisions. The kids deserve better than your fantasies. She deleted it without responding, the way she'd learned to delete his voice from her head during the long nights when the electricity was cut off, and she'd sit in candlelight with her twin boys, reading library books about farming and self-sufficiency. 8-year-old Tommy had asked why Daddy didn't live with them anymore, and 6-year-old James had simply stated, "Daddy says Mommy is crazy." The words had hit harder than any of Marcus's screaming matches about her unrealistic dreams and financial irresponsibility. The farm was 2 hours north of Lincoln, accessible only by a dirt road that hadn't seen county maintenance in a decade. Sarah's rusted Honda Civic wheezed and shuddered as she navigated the potholes. Her sons pressed against the back windows, their breath fogging the glass as they stared at the endless expanse of brown grass and scattered cedar trees. The GPS had lost signal 20 minutes ago, leaving them to navigate by landmarks: a collapsed barn that leaned like a drunk against the horizon, a water tower painted with faded high school initials, and finally, the rusted mailbox that marked the entrance to their new life. The farmhouse stood like a monument to better times. 2 stories of white clapboard siding gone gray with neglect, a wraparound porch sagging under the weight of missing shingles and broken dreams. The previous owner, Eleanor Hartwell, had died the winter before, leaving the property burdened with back taxes. "This is our house?" James whispered, his small voice cutting through the silence as they climbed the porch steps. Each board creaked a different note, creating a discordant symphony under their feet. The front door hung slightly crooked in its frame, held shut by a padlock that had rusted to the color of dried blood. "This is our home," Sarah corrected gently, though her own voice wavered with uncertainty. She fumbled with the key the county clerk had handed her, a brass skeleton key that looked like something from a Gothic novel. The lock turned with surprising ease, and the door swung open to reveal a universe of dust motes dancing in the late afternoon sunlight. The interior was a time capsule from the 1970s. Avocado green appliances in the kitchen, orange shag carpet in the living room, and wood paneling that absorbed light like a black hole. But it was clean, surprisingly so, as if Eleanor Hartwell had spent her final months preparing for visitors who would never come. On the kitchen table, covered by a yellow doily, sat an envelope addressed simply, "To the new family." Sarah opened it with trembling fingers while her boys explored the house, their footsteps echoing through empty rooms above. The letter was written in careful cursive on lavender stationery. "Dear ones, if you're reading this, then the land has chosen you the way it chose me 52 years ago. This farm has secrets, not the kind that hurt, but the kind that heal if you're patient enough to listen. The well dried up in '89, but there's water here, deep water. You'll need to dig, but don't give up. The land will provide if you prove you're worthy of its gifts. There's a map in the cellar, behind the preserves. Trust the old ways. Trust your instincts. Trust each other. With love and hope, Eleanor." Tommy appeared at Sarah's elbow, reading over her shoulder with the precociousness that had always impressed his teachers and irritated his father. "Mom, what does she mean about the well, and what's in the cellar?" Before Sarah could answer, a truck engine growled in the driveway, a sound like controlled thunder that made the windows rattle. Through the kitchen curtains, she watched a red Chevy pickup navigate the potholes with practiced ease. The driver was a man in his 50s, wearing a John Deere cap and flannel shirt, his weathered hands gripping the steering wheel like he'd been born holding it. He knocked on the front door with the confidence of someone who belonged here more than she did. "Ma'am, I'm Dale Morrison, your neighbor to the south. Wanted to introduce myself, and well—" He paused, taking in her appearance with a quick assessment of someone who'd spent decades reading livestock and weather patterns. "Wanted to make sure you knew what you'd gotten yourself into." Dale's eyes were the color of February sky, gray with hints of storm. He'd clearly come straight from his own farm, dirt under his fingernails, and hay stuck to his boots. But there was kindness in the way he crouched down to Tommy and James's level, introducing himself with the same gravity he'd shown their mother. "This is a hard place," he said, straightening up and addressing Sarah directly. Eleanor was tough as boot leather, and even she struggled. "No offense, ma'am, but you don't look like you've spent much time working land." Sarah felt her cheeks burn, but not with embarrassment, with determination. "I'm stronger than I look." "I hope so." Dale glanced around the property with the expression of someone surveying a battlefield. "Winter's coming fast this year. You'll need firewood, propane, and a way to get water. The well's been dry for 30+ years. You'll have to truck it in or drill new." "How much does it cost to drill a well?" "Depends how deep you need to go. Could be a few thousand, could be 20. This particular ground." He shook his head. "Every farmer in the county's tried to make something of this place. The Kowalskis went bankrupt trying to irrigate it. The Peterson boys gave up after 2 seasons. There's something about the soil composition that just doesn't cooperate." As if summoned by their conversation, another vehicle appeared, a white van with Morrison Family Farm painted on the side. The driver was a woman about Sarah's age, with calloused hands and laugh lines that spoke of someone who'd found joy despite the hardships Dale had just catalogued. "I'm Linda Morrison," she said, emerging from the van with a casserole dish that steamed in the cooling air. "Thought you might be hungry after a day like today." She handed the dish to Sarah with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been feeding neighbors for decades. "Tuna noodle casserole. Nothing fancy. But it'll stick to your ribs." The kindness was overwhelming after months of legal battles and social workers and neighbors who'd watched their life collapse with the morbid fascination reserved for car accidents. Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back, determined not to cry in front of her new neighbors. "That's very kind, thank you." Linda studied the boys with the sharp eyes of a mother who'd raised 3 children of her own. "You boys ever been on a farm before?" They shook their heads in unison, wide-eyed and uncertain. "Well then, tomorrow's Saturday. If your mom doesn't mind, you can come help me feed the chickens. Learn how things work out here." Dale was examining the porch supports with the professional interest of someone mentally calculating repair costs. "Ma'am." "Sarah, I don't want to overstep, but this place is going to need work before winter hits proper. The roof's got problems, the foundation's questionable, and without running water." He trailed off diplomatically. "I can work," Sarah said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "I can learn." Learning's one thing, having the money for materials is another. Dale's words weren't cruel, just practical in the way of farmers who'd learned to measure dreams against reality. The hardware store in town extends credit to established folks, but newcomers— another diplomatic pause. Sarah felt the familiar weight of financial impossibility, settling on her shoulders like a lead blanket. $400. That's what stood between her family and homelessness, between hope and surrender. The math was brutal. Winter supplies, basic repairs, food for 3 mouths, and now the cost of drilling a well that might not even produce water. As if reading her thoughts, Dale cleared his throat. "There's always the government assistance programs. County has funds for rural development. Nothing wrong with accepting help when you need it." The suggestion hit like a physical blow. Sarah had spent the last year fighting to avoid exactly that. The food stamps, the subsidized housing, the pitying looks from caseworkers who'd seen too many broken families to maintain much optimism. She'd bought this farm with the last of her pride and what remained of her mother's life insurance money. Going back to the welfare office would feel like admitting defeat. "I appreciate the offer, but we'll manage," she said, though the words tasted like sawdust in her mouth. Linda and Dale exchanged the kind of look that married couples perfect over decades, an entire conversation compressed into a glance. Linda stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "Honey, managing and surviving are 2 different things. Pride's a luxury you can't afford with 2 young boys depending on you." As if to emphasize the point, the autumn wind picked up, rattling the loose siding and sending a shower of leaves across the porch. Tommy shivered and moved closer to his mother, while James began exploring the porch swing, testing its stability with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "How deep would we need to drill for water?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. Dale rubbed his chin, calculating. Hartwell tried twice over the years. First time they hit clay at 50 feet. Second time was in the 80s. Went down 200 feet and found nothing but more clay. The geological survey said something about the rock formations being all wrong for groundwater. But Eleanor's letter mentioned water, deep water. Eleanor said a lot of things in her later years, Linda said gently. She was lonely after her husband passed. Sometimes people see signs that aren't there. The sun was setting behind the cedar trees, painting the grassland in shades of amber and rust. In the dying light, the farm looked almost beautiful, the kind of austere beauty that photographers captured in coffee table books about rural America. But beauty didn't pay for heating oil or put food on the table. "There's a man in town," Dale said suddenly, as if reaching a decision. "Jack Patterson, runs a drilling outfit. He's fair, and he might be willing to work out a payment plan if he thinks you're serious about staying." "How would he know if I'm serious?" "Same way the rest of us will know." Dale pointed to the overgrown field stretching toward the horizon. "By what you do with this place. Land doesn't lie, Sarah. It'll either accept you or it won't. But you can't fake commitment. The soil knows the difference between someone passing through and someone planning to stay." As the Morrisons prepared to leave, Linda pressed a slip of paper into Sarah's hand. Phone numbers for the hardware store, the co-op, and half a dozen other businesses that kept small farms functioning. "Call if you need anything. And I mean anything. We look after each other out here." Their truck disappeared down the dirt road, leaving Sarah and her boys alone with their new reality. The farmhouse felt larger in the darkness, filled with the settling sounds of old wood and unknown possibilities. They ate the casserole by candlelight. The electricity wouldn't be connected until Monday, while Sarah read Eleanor's letter again, searching for clues in the careful cursive. That night, they slept on the living room floor with sleeping bags and borrowed blankets. The boys fell asleep quickly, exhausted by the day's upheaval, but Sarah lay awake listening to the sounds of the country night. Coyotes called from the distant hills, their voices rising and falling like a natural orchestra. The wind moved through the grass with a whisper that might have been Eleanor's ghost offering encouragement or warning. In the darkness, Sarah made a silent promise to the land, to her sleeping sons, and to herself. She would make this work. Whatever it took, however deep she had to dig, she would prove that Dale Morrison was wrong about one thing. She wasn't just someone passing through. This was home now, and she would fight for it with everything she had. The question that kept her awake wasn't whether she had the strength to succeed. She knew she did. The question was whether the land would accept her offering of sweat, determination, and stubborn hope. By morning, she would begin to find out. Monday morning arrived with the cruel precision of bills and obligations. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of Tommy coughing, a dry, persistent hack that made her chest tighten with familiar worry. The farmhouse held cold like a stone church, and their breath misted in the kitchen as she heated water on the gas stove for instant oatmeal. The boys sat wrapped in blankets at Eleanor's kitchen table, their eyes still heavy with sleep and adjustment. "Are we really going to live here forever?" James asked, stirring his oatmeal into gray paste. At 6, he possessed the brutal honesty of childhood, the ability to ask questions that adults spent lifetimes avoiding. "This is our home now," Sarah repeated, though the words felt like borrowed clothes that didn't quite fit. She'd been saying variations of this phrase for 3 days, as much to convince herself as her sons. Forever is a long time. Let's start with today. The electricity had been connected as promised, bringing harsh fluorescent light to rooms that had been softened by candles and hope. In the unforgiving morning brightness, the kitchen looked shabbier, the water stains on the ceiling more ominous, the avocado appliances more dated. The refrigerator hummed with mechanical uncertainty, and the electric baseboard heaters clicked and wheezed like old men with respiratory problems. Sarah had exactly $217 left after paying the utility deposits. Not enough for heating oil, propane, or the phone bill. Her first task was enrollment at the local elementary school. Millfield was 12 miles away. A cluster of grain elevators, a post office, 3 churches, and a school that served students from 100 square miles of farmland. The building was brick and practical, built in the 1950s when farm families were larger and more numerous. Now it struggled with declining enrollment and budget cuts that showed in the patched parking lot and windows covered with plastic sheeting for winter. Principal Martha Hendricks was a woman in her 60s who'd spent 4 decades watching farm families come and go. She had the patient demeanor of someone who'd learned not to get too attached to student enrollment, since families left as often as they arrived. Her office smelled of coffee and copy toner, with walls covered by decades of class photos showing groups that grew smaller each year. "Mrs. Chen," she said, reviewing the enrollment paperwork with practiced efficiency. "The boys will be in Mrs. Patterson's 2nd grade and Mr. Coleman's 4th grade respectively. Both excellent teachers. They'll need current immunization records, previous school transcripts, and proof of residence." Sarah provided the documents, noting how Mrs. Hendricks's eyebrows rose slightly at the Hartwell farm address. "That's quite a project you've taken on," she said diplomatically. "Eleanor was a fixture in this community for over 50 years. Did you know her well?" Everyone knew Eleanor. She substituted here for 30 years, taught Sunday school at First Methodist, organized the county fair baking competition. Mrs. Hendricks paused, choosing her words carefully. She was dedicated to that land. Sometimes people worried she was too isolated out there, especially after Harold passed. There it was again, the gentle implication that the farm was somehow cursed, that previous attempts at success had ended in failure or worse. Sarah was beginning to understand that rural communities had long memories for both triumph and tragedy, and that newcomers inherited the weight of every previous story. "The boys have been through some significant changes recently," Sarah said, trying to strike the right balance between honesty and privacy. "Divorce, moving, starting over. They might need some extra patience while they adjust." Mrs. Hendricks nodded with the understanding of someone who'd shepherded children through every variety of family crisis. "Rural schools are good at that kind of flexibility. Everyone knows everyone here, which means everyone looks out for everyone. Your boys will do fine." The first week established a routine that felt like walking a tightrope over an abyss of uncertainty. Sarah would wake at 5:30, start coffee on the temperamental stove, wake the boys, prepare breakfast from dwindling supplies, drive them to school, and then return to the farm for 8 hours of learning how to be someone she'd never imagined becoming. Her city-soft hands blistered from hauling firewood and cracked from the constant exposure to cold and dry air. She learned to split kindling with a hatchet Eleanor had left in the barn, developed calluses from scraping, peeling paint off the porch rails, and discovered muscles she'd forgotten she had while hauling water from the Morrison farm in 5-gallon jugs. The physical labor was actually the easy part. Harder was the loneliness that settled over the farm like ground fog, thick and disorienting. During the day, she could distract herself with projects, cleaning Eleanor's accumulated possessions, patching holes in window screens, researching grants for rural development. But evenings were brutal. The boys would finish their homework at the kitchen table while she prepared dinner on the bulky gas stove, and then they'd sit in the living room playing board games or reading library books while the wind reminded them how isolated they were. Tommy's cough persisted, developing a wheeze that made her consider the 60-mile drive to the nearest urgent care clinic. But that would mean taking both boys out of school, spending money they didn't have, and possibly discovering they needed prescriptions she couldn't afford. She'd been without health insurance since Marcus's company had terminated her coverage in the divorce settlement. "Mom, why did Dad say we couldn't come live with him?" James asked one evening while she read to them from a picture book about farm animals. The question came from nowhere, with the devastating timing children perfect unconsciously. Sarah closed the book, marking their place with a grocery receipt. "Dad lives in an apartment now. It's not big enough for all of us." "But his apartment has heat that works all the time," Tommy pointed out with the logical precision that made him both gifted and difficult. "And cable TV. And pizza delivery." She couldn't argue with 8-year-old economics. Marcus's lawyer had arranged for him to keep the steady income, the reliable car, and the comfortable lifestyle, while she received what the court termed equitable distribution of assets that had somehow evaporated during the proceedings. The boys spent alternate weekends with their father in Lincoln, returning with stories of restaurants and movie theaters and the kind of urban conveniences that highlighted everything their new life lacked. "Sometimes the best things require the most work," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "We're building something here. Something that belongs to us." "What are we building?" James asked with genuine curiosity. The question haunted her through sleepless nights when the wind howled around the farmhouse, and the heating system struggled to maintain 60 degrees. What exactly were they building? She'd bought the land on instinct, driven by desperation and a half-remembered conversation with her grandmother about the value of owning something that couldn't be taken away. But ownership without the resources to maintain it was just elaborate homelessness. Her daily routine included checking Eleanor's mailbox, though she dreaded the accumulation of bills and notices. County tax statements, utility bills, offers for farm equipment she couldn't afford, and catalogs for seeds she didn't know how to plant. But on Thursday of their second week, she found something different. A hand-addressed envelope from Jack Patterson Drilling. Inside was a business card and a handwritten note. Mrs. Chen, Dale Morrison mentioned you might need well services. I'd be interested in discussing options that work with your budget. I've got some time next Tuesday if you'd like me to take a look at your property. No charge for consultation. Jack Patterson. The kindness of strangers was almost harder to bear than their skepticism. Sarah had spent the last year learning to interpret offers of help. Which ones came with strings attached, which ones were genuine, and which ones were motivated by pity rather than respect. Jack Patterson's note felt different, businesslike but respectful, acknowledging her financial constraints without condescension. She called the number from the farmhouse's ancient rotary phone, its mechanical clicks and whirs a sound from another era. Jack answered on the third ring with the gruff efficiency of someone accustomed to conducting business quickly. Patterson Drilling. This is Sarah Chen. You left a note about well consultation? Right, the Hartwell place. Dale said you folks might need water access. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd spent decades solving problems with machinery and expertise. I could stop by Tuesday afternoon, take a look at the geology, discuss options. Mr. Patterson, I need to be honest about my financial situation. Ma'am, let's see what we're dealing with before we worry about money. Sometimes the solution's simpler than people think. Sometimes it's more complicated. Either way, looking doesn't cost anything. Tuesday afternoon brought the first hard frost of the season. Silver crystals that turned the brown grass into something magical and treacherous. Sarah met Jack Patterson at the property line, noting how his truck, newer than the Morrisons but still practical, handled the rutted driveway with mechanical confidence. Jack was younger than she'd expected, maybe 45, with the lean build of someone who spent his days wrestling with heavy equipment. His handshake was firm without being performative, and his eyes moved across the property with professional assessment rather than judgment. Show me where Eleanor had the previous wells drilled, he said, pulling on work gloves against the morning chill. They walked the property together, following Sarah's interpretation of Eleanor's hand-drawn map. The first drilling site was marked by a concrete cap near the barn, a failed attempt from the 1960s that had produced only clay and disappointment. The second site, closer to the house, was marked by a rusted casing that rose from the ground like a mechanical gravestone. Jack pulled instruments from his truck, devices that looked like metal detectors crossed with surveying equipment. He moved methodically across the property, taking readings and making notes on a clipboard weathered by years of outdoor use. Interesting, he murmured after 40 minutes of silent work. The subsurface here is more complex than I expected. Is that good or bad? Depends on what we find when we dig. Jack straightened, studying his notes with the expression of someone solving a puzzle. The geological survey from the 80s showed impermeable clay layers, but surveys can miss things. Underground water moves in ways that don't always make sense from the surface. He pointed to a spot about 100 yards from the house, where the land sloped gently toward a line of cottonwood trees. Eleanor's letter mentioned deep water. If I were going to try again, I'd start there. The trees suggest something's drawing moisture, and the elevation change might indicate a different rock formation. How deep would you need to go? Could be 200 feet, could be 400. Won't know until we start. Jack's honesty was both refreshing and terrifying. But here's what I'm thinking. I've got a project that got postponed until spring. My crew needs the work, and I've got equipment that's going to sit idle for 3 months. If you're willing to take a gamble, I'm willing to work out terms. Sarah felt her heart speed up with something that might have been hope or might have been panic. What kind of terms? I drill the well. If we hit water, good, clean, sustainable water, you pay standard rates over 2 years, no interest. If we don't hit water, you pay for materials only. My time and equipment are free. The offer was so generous it felt dangerous, like a trap disguised as salvation. Why would you do that? Jack was quiet for a moment, looking across the property toward the distant highway. I grew up on a farm like this. Different county, same story. My dad tried everything to make it work. Different crops, different livestock, government programs. Nothing took. We lost it when I was 17. He paused, seeming to decide how much personal history to share with a near stranger. Sometimes a place just needs someone who believes in it enough to do the hard work. Eleanor believed. Dale Morrison thinks maybe you do too. And if I don't, if we drill and find nothing and I can't even pay for materials, then we'll figure something out. Jack's pragmatism was reassuring without being patronizing. But let's not borrow trouble. The way I see it, you've got two choices. Try and maybe fail, or don't try and definitely fail. Winter's coming whether you've got water or not. That evening, Sarah sat at Eleanor's kitchen table with a legal pad, trying to perform financial alchemy that would transform their circumstances into something sustainable. 2 years to pay for well drilling, if they found water. Materials costs only if they didn't. The arithmetic was still terrifying, but it was arithmetic that led somewhere other than surrender. She called Marcus's number, knowing he'd answer with the weary exasperation of someone forced to deal with his ex-wife's latest crisis. The conversation was brief and predictably unpleasant. Jesus, Sarah, well, do you have any idea how much that costs? Actually, I do. That's why I'm calling. Let me guess. You want me to help pay for your latest fantasy? The answer is no. I pay child support. That's my legal obligation. Your housing choices are your problem. The boys need running water, Marcus. It's basic health and safety. The boys need stability. They need a mother who makes practical decisions instead of chasing some pioneer fantasy. His voice carried the familiar mix of frustration and condescension that had characterized the final years of their marriage. Bring them back to Lincoln. Find an apartment you can actually afford. Stop pretending you're some kind of frontier woman. The conversation ended the way their marriage had, with Marcus convinced of his own reasonableness and Sarah left holding responsibility for consequences he refused to acknowledge. But this time, instead of feeling defeated, she felt clarified. The well wasn't just about water. It was about proving that belief and hard work could triumph over skepticism and surrender. She spent the evening researching agricultural grants, rural development programs, and emergency assistance funds. The applications were complex, requiring documentation she didn't have and timeframes that wouldn't help with immediate needs. But buried in the paperwork, she found something interesting. A state program that provided low-interest loans for rural infrastructure development, specifically including water access projects. The program required proof of intent to establish sustainable agriculture, evidence of community support, and a detailed business plan showing potential for economic viability. Sarah had never written a business plan, barely understood what sustainable agriculture meant beyond the conceptual level, and wasn't sure how to demonstrate community support from neighbors she'd known for 2 weeks. But she had something else. Eleanor's letter mentioning agricultural potential, property records showing decades of tax payments, and 43 acres of land that someone had once believed in, enough to call home for 50 years. Maybe that was enough to start with. By midnight, surrounded by farm journals borrowed from the library and agricultural extension bulletins downloaded from government websites, Sarah began drafting a proposal for something she was still learning to understand. A plan to transform abandoned farmland into sustainable agriculture using water that might or might not exist 200 feet beneath the surface. The plan was ambitious, probably unrealistic, and definitely beyond her current capabilities. It involved crops she'd never grown, irrigation systems she'd never seen, and market analyses based on optimistic projections rather than experience. But it was also something else, a bridge between who she'd been and who she was determined to become. The confrontation began with a knock that shattered the Tuesday morning quiet like breaking glass. Sarah was reviewing agricultural extension pamphlets at the kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside Eleanor's handwritten notes about soil composition, when 3 sharp raps on the front door announced trouble with bureaucratic precision. Through the window, she could see a white sedan with county plates and 2 figures in dark coats consulting clipboards with the grim efficiency of undertakers. Her stomach dropped as she recognized the universal posture of officials bearing bad news. Shoulders squared, expressions carefully neutral, documents organized for maximum intimidation. Mrs. Chen? The woman was 40-something, wearing a tan overcoat over a business suit that spoke of climate-controlled offices and pension benefits. Her companion was younger, male, carrying a camera, and wearing the uncomfortable expression of someone new to delivering bureaucratic devastation. "I'm Janet Reeves from the County Health Department. This is Inspector Morrison, no relation to your neighbors, from Code Enforcement." Sarah's hands trembled as she accepted the official documents they thrust toward her. The letterhead was imposing: Notice of Health Code Violations and Immediate Compliance Required. The text that followed was dense with regulatory language, but the meaning was clear enough. Someone had filed a complaint about the property, triggering an investigation that had found multiple violations of county health and safety codes. Violations? Sarah's voice sounded thin in the morning air. What kind of violations? Inspector Morrison cleared his throat, consulting his clipboard with the mechanical precision of someone hiding behind procedure. Inadequate sewage disposal system, no approved source of potable water, electrical systems not up to current code, and improper storage of fuel for heating. He paused, seeming to gather courage for the next part. Also, the structure itself hasn't been inspected for habitability in over 20 years. "This is a working farm," Sarah protested, though even as she said it, she knew how unconvincing the words sounded. The overgrown fields and abandoned equipment visible from the porch told a different story. "Was a working farm," Janet Reeves corrected with the gentle firmness of someone accustomed to crushing dreams efficiently. "Current county records show no active agricultural operations, no livestock, no crop production. As far as our assessment, this is a residential property that doesn't meet basic habitability standards." The younger inspector was photographing everything: the sagging porch, the disconnected propane tank, the extension cords running from the barn to supplement the house's inadequate electrical system. Each flash felt like evidence being gathered for a prosecution Sarah didn't understand she was facing. "Ma'am," Inspector Morrison said, his discomfort evident in the way he avoided eye contact, "we've received reports about children living in conditions that may not meet state safety requirements. We're required to investigate any complaints involving minors." The word reports hit like a physical blow. Someone had called in a complaint about her boys, about their living conditions, about her ability to provide for them safely. The list of potential accusers was short and devastating. Marcus, neighbors who viewed their arrival as an intrusion, or well-meaning busybodies who couldn't distinguish between rural living and neglect. "Who filed the complaint?" "That information is confidential," Janet Reeves said, though something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely comfortable with the confidentiality. "Our concern is ensuring that any residential property meets basic health and safety standards, especially when children are involved." The farmhouse had serious problems: outdated electrical, questionable septic, no water, and heating code violations. "You have 30 days to bring the property into compliance," Janet Reeves explained, handing Sarah a thick packet of forms and requirements. "Electrical inspection and certification, septic system evaluation and repair if necessary, establishment of an approved water source, and general habitability certification." Sarah flipped through the requirements with growing horror. Each item represented hundreds or thousands of dollars in professional services and materials. The electrical certification alone would require an electrician to inspect and probably rewire significant portions of the house. The septic evaluation would involve excavation and possibly complete system replacement. The water source requirement brought her back to Jack Patterson and the well that might or might not exist beneath their feet. "What happens if I can't meet these requirements in 30 days? The two inspectors exchanged glances, having clearly anticipated this question. Inspector Morrison cleared his throat again, a nervous habit that was beginning to irritate Sarah despite her precarious position. The property would be deemed uninhabitable. Residents would need to find alternative housing until compliance is achieved. Alternative housing was bureaucratic language for homelessness with children, which was bureaucratic language for losing custody to the state. Sarah understood the subtext perfectly: comply or lose everything. After the inspectors left, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the violation notices until the words blurred together. The mathematics were brutal. Even if Jack Patterson drilled a successful well for free, even if she could somehow finance the electrical and septic work, she would need to come up with at least $15,000 in 30 days to keep her family together. She called Dale Morrison, hoping his practical experience might suggest solutions the bureaucrats hadn't mentioned. His voice was grim when she explained the morning's visit. "Damn it," he said, and she could hear the frustration that came from watching good people crushed by systems that prioritized paperwork over common sense. "I was afraid something like this might happen. You know who filed the complaint?" Dale was quiet for a moment, and she could almost hear him weighing loyalty against honesty. "I've got suspicions, but nothing I can prove. What matters now is dealing with what they've handed you." "Dale, I don't have $15,000. I don't have $1,500. "I know, honey. Linda and I have been talking." Another pause, heavy with the kind of careful consideration that preceded life-changing offers. "We might be able to help with some of the immediate costs. The electrical work, maybe part of the septic evaluation." The kindness was overwhelming, but Sarah had learned to examine generosity for hidden costs. "Why would you do that? You barely know us." "Because Eleanor would have wanted someone to help. And because—" Dale's voice carried the weight of personal history. "Because 30 years ago, when Linda was pregnant with our first and I was trying to make payments on this place, the Kowalskis helped us through a rough patch. Sometimes you pay kindness forward instead of back." Before Sarah could respond, another vehicle was turning into the driveway, a sleek black SUV that looked as out of place as a tuxedo at a barn raising. The driver was a man in an expensive overcoat, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Dale, I have to go. Someone else is here." "Sarah, be careful who you trust right now. Word travels fast in small towns, and there are always people looking to take advantage of situations like this." The warning proved prophetic. The man introduced himself as Richard Carlisle from Midwest Development Partners, producing a business card with embossed lettering that suggested serious money behind serious intentions. He was maybe 50, with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from golf courses rather than farm work. "Mrs. Chen, I understand you're experiencing some difficulties with the property." His voice carried the sympathetic tone of a funeral director discussing payment plans. "I represent investors who specialize in helping families transition out of situations that have become challenging." Sarah kept the screen door between them, though she couldn't say exactly why. Something about Carlisle's presence felt predatory, like a well-dressed vulture circling something wounded but not quite dead. "What kind of help?" "We'd be interested in purchasing the property, Mrs. Chen, full fair market value, plus assistance with relocation costs. You and your boys could start fresh somewhere more suitable for your needs." The offer was tempting in the way that surrender always seemed reasonable when you were exhausted from fighting. Sarah could imagine the relief of walking away. No more code violations, no more financial impossibilities, no more responsibility for Eleanor's dreams and 43 acres of stubborn earth. How much fair market value? Carlisle consulted a leather portfolio with theatrical precision. "Based on current agricultural land values in the county, we'd be prepared to offer $8,000, with an additional $2,000 for relocation expenses." $10,000. It was more money than Sarah had seen in months, enough to rent an apartment in Lincoln, buy a reliable car, maybe even save something for the boys' future. It was also roughly half of what she'd need to bring the property into compliance with county codes. "I paid $400 for this land 3 weeks ago. You're offering $10,000. Why?" Land values fluctuate based on development potential, mineral rights, proximity to infrastructure improvements. Carlisle's explanation was smooth and practiced, but it didn't answer the question she'd actually asked. "The important thing is that we can solve your immediate problem and help you move forward." There was something else, a calculation behind Carlisle's eyes that suggested he knew things about the property that she didn't. Sarah remembered Eleanor's letter mentioning secrets and Dale's comments about the complex geology that had frustrated previous drilling attempts. "I need time to think about it." "Of course. But Mrs. Chen, time is a luxury you may not have. County compliance requirements don't pause for consideration, and winter housing for a family with children." He left the threat unfinished, allowing Sarah's imagination to complete the picture of bureaucratic consequences. After Carlisle left, Sarah walked the property lines, trying to see 43 acres through the eyes of someone willing to pay 25 times what she'd invested. The land looked the same as it had that morning: brown grass, scattered cedar, the promise of winter in the October wind. But now it felt different, weighted with possibilities she didn't understand and value she couldn't calculate. That afternoon brought another confrontation, this one wearing a badge and the grim authority of Child Protective Services. Detective Susan Park was accompanied by a social worker named Amanda Chen. No relation, despite the shared surname that created an uncomfortable moment of awkward explanation. "We're here about a referral concerning the welfare of 2 minor children," Detective Park explained. Though her tone suggested sympathy rather than suspicion, we're required to investigate any reports of children living in potentially unsafe conditions. The potentially unsafe conditions were the same issues the code enforcement officers had documented: inadequate heating, uncertain electrical systems, no reliable water source. But when viewed through the lens of child welfare rather than building codes, they became evidence of neglect rather than challenges to be overcome. Amanda Chen was younger, maybe late 20s, with the earnest demeanor of someone new enough to the job to still believe she was helping rather than prosecuting. She took notes while Detective Park asked questions designed to sound casual while establishing legal grounds for intervention. How are the boys adjusting to the move? They're doing well in school, making friends, learning about farm life. And their father? Is he involved in their care? The question was a minefield. Too much honesty about Marcus's abandonment might suggest instability. Too little might suggest she was hiding something problematic. Their father lives in Lincoln. They visit him regularly. Sarah chose diplomatic language that avoided mentioning how those visits usually ended, with the boys returning with stories about their father's new girlfriend and questions about why they had to live on a farm without cable television. Detective Park was examining the propane heater in the living room with the professional interest of someone cataloging evidence. "Mrs. Chen, can you walk me through your typical evening routine? Dinner preparation, homework, bedtime." The questions continued for an hour, each one innocuous on its surface, but collectively building a case Sarah didn't fully understand. They were documenting not just the physical conditions of the house, but her competence as a parent, her decision-making processes, her ability to provide stability in an inherently unstable situation. "The county has programs available," Amanda Chen said as they prepared to leave. "Temporary housing assistance, child care support, job training programs. Sometimes accepting help isn't a sign of failure. It's a sign of putting your children's needs first." After they left, Sarah stood in the kitchen holding their business cards and staring at the phone number for emergency housing assistance. The walls felt like they were closing in, not just physically, but legally and financially and emotionally. Every door seemed to lead to surrender. Every option required abandoning the dream that had brought them here. Tommy and James returned from school to find their mother sitting at the kitchen table, surrounded by official documents and empty coffee cups. They developed the preternatural sensitivity to adult distress that children acquire when their world becomes unpredictable. "Mom, are we in trouble?" Tommy asked, his 8-year-old voice carrying worry that no child should have to bear. "We're working through some challenges," Sarah said, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "Sometimes grown-up problems are complicated, but that doesn't mean we can't solve them. Are we going to move again?" James's question was practical rather than emotional, as if he'd already begun calculating the logistics of another upheaval. "I don't know yet. But whatever happens, we're going to face it together." That evening, while the boys did homework at the kitchen table, Sarah made a series of phone calls that felt like rolling dice with their future. Jack Patterson first, to accelerate the timeline for well drilling. The County Housing Authority, to understand exactly what emergency assistance would require. And finally, reluctantly, the legal aid office in Lincoln to discuss her options if the county attempted to remove her children from the home. Each conversation added weight to her understanding of how precarious their situation had become. Jack could start drilling within the week, but success wasn't guaranteed. Emergency housing assistance was available, but it would require admitting failure and accepting charity that came with strings attached. Legal aid could help her navigate the bureaucracy, but they couldn't change the fundamental mathematics of poverty and rural isolation. The last call was the most difficult. Marcus answered on the 4th ring, his voice carrying the irritation of someone interrupted during something more important. "Sarah, what crisis is it this time?" "The county is investigating our living conditions. They might try to remove the boys from the home." The silence that followed was loaded with the kind of calculation she'd learned to recognize during their marriage. Marcus was weighing his legal obligations against his personal convenience. measuring the benefits of playing the concerned father against the costs of actual involvement. Jesus, I told you this would happen. I told you that place wasn't suitable for children. Are you going to help or just criticize? What kind of help? You want me to pay for fixing up that disaster you bought? You want me to take the boys until you get your act together? What exactly are you asking? Sarah realized she didn't know what she was asking. Money he didn't want to give? Emotional support he'd never provided? Acknowledgement that she was trying to build something worthwhile rather than indulging in destructive fantasy? I'm asking you to remember that these are your sons too. That their stability matters more than proving you were right about my decisions. Their stability is exactly what I'm worried about. Maybe it's time to consider that you're in over your head, Sarah. Maybe it's time to admit that good intentions aren't enough when you don't have the resources to back them up. The conversation ended with Marcus promising to think about his options, which was lawyer speak for consulting his attorney about how to use the county investigation to modify custody arrangements in his favor. Sarah hung up feeling more isolated than ever, trapped between bureaucratic requirements she couldn't meet and an ex-husband whose help came with the price of admission that she'd failed. As she was tucking the boys into bed, sleeping bags in the living room again, since the upstairs bedrooms were too cold without adequate heating, Tommy asked the question she'd been dreading. Mom, if we can't live here anymore, where will we go? We'll figure something out, sweetheart. We always do. But what if we can't? What if they make us live in different places? The question hung in the darkness like a physical presence. Sarah had been avoiding the possibility that Child Protective Services might decide she was an unfit parent, that the boys would be safer in foster care or with their father until she could prove her ability to provide adequate housing. That's not going to happen, she said, though the words felt like a prayer rather than a promise. We're going to fight for this place. We're going to make it work. How? It was the same question she'd been asking herself for weeks, the question that kept her awake listening to coyotes and wind and the settling sounds of an old house, struggling to shelter a family that needed more than it could provide. I don't know yet, but sometimes the best solutions come when you're desperate enough to try things that seemed impossible before. The next morning brought news that changed everything, though not in ways Sarah could have anticipated. Dale Morrison called before 7, his voice carrying excitement and urgency she hadn't heard before. Sarah, you need to get down to the Morrison place. Now, bring the boys if you have to, but get down here. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Something's right. Something's very right. And you need to see it for yourself. She drove to the Morrison farm with growing anxiety, the boys still in their pajamas and coats, unsure whether they were fleeing another crisis or stumbling toward an opportunity. The scene at the Morrison place was chaotic. Linda running between the house and barn, Dale shouting instructions to someone on the phone, and Jack Patterson's drilling truck parked in the driveway with equipment scattered around it like the aftermath of an industrial accident. Jack met them at the truck, his face streaked with mud and something that might have been tears or might have been groundwater. His clothes were soaked, and he was grinning with the kind of joy that suggested either madness or miracle. Sarah, he said, his voice cracking with exhaustion and elation, we need to talk. Jack Patterson's hands were shaking as he poured coffee from Linda Morrison's thermos, the liquid sloshing over the rim and spattering on his boots. He'd been awake for 36 hours straight, ever since his experimental drilling on the Morrison property had produced results that defied everything he thought he knew about geology, hydrology, and the practical limits of hope. I started drilling yesterday morning, he said, his voice hoarse from shouting instructions over machinery and making phone calls to people who initially didn't believe what he was telling them. Figured I'd test my theory about the water table before committing to your property. Hit clay at 50 feet, just like expected, hit more clay at 100 feet. Started thinking maybe everyone was right about this being dead ground. Sarah clutched her coffee cup, afraid to breathe too deeply lest she somehow dispel whatever miracle Jack was building toward with his explanation. The boys pressed against her sides, sensing the adult tension without understanding its source. Then at 230 feet, we broke through into something I've never seen in 30 years of drilling. Not just water, Sarah. An underground river. Flowing fast and clean and cold, like it's been waiting down there for someone to find it. He pulled out his phone, showing her a video that captured the moment his drill broke through the rock barrier. The footage was shaky and poorly lit, but unmistakable, a geyser of clear water shooting 20 feet into the air, catching the afternoon sunlight like liquid crystal. "How much water?" Sarah asked, though she wasn't sure she understood the significance of what she was seeing. "More than we could use in a lifetime," Dale Morrison answered, appearing beside them with the expression of someone who'd witnessed something that challenged his understanding of the possible. "Jack's called in hydrologists from the state university. They're saying it's connected to an underground system that extends for miles, fed by runoff from the sandhills that's been filtering through rock for decades." Linda Morrison was practically vibrating with excitement, clutching Sarah's arm with the fierce joy of someone whose faith in impossible things had been vindicated. "But that's not the best part. Tell her about what else you found, Jack." Jack's grin became almost manic, the expression of someone who'd stumbled across buried treasure while looking for loose change. He reached into his truck and pulled out a white cloth bundle, unwrapping it with the reverence reserved for religious artifacts or explosive devices. Inside were stones. Not ordinary stones. These caught the morning light and threw it back in prismatic rainbows that danced across their faces like captured starlight. Even Sarah, who knew nothing about geology or gemstones, recognized what she was seeing. "Diamonds," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Industrial grade at first, mixed in with the gravel at 200 feet. But as we went deeper..." He unwrapped another cloth, revealing stones that were larger, clearer, obviously more valuable even to untrained eyes. "These came up from 260 feet. There are more. A lot more." The silence that followed was punctuated only by the sound of Tommy's sharp intake of breath and James's whispered, "Holy cow," which, under other circumstances, would have prompted a lecture about appropriate language. "How much more?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand that the question revealed the poverty of her imagination rather than the limitations of Jack's discovery. "I called a friend who works for a mining company in Colorado," Jack said, rewrapping the stones with careful precision. "Send him photos, describing the geological formation. He thinks we're looking at a significant deposit. Not just scattered stones, but a concentrated source that could have been building for millions of years." Dale Morrison was shaking his head with the bewilderment of someone whose practical worldview was colliding with Hollywood fantasy. Eleanor always said there were secrets in this ground. Always claimed the land would provide for whoever was brave enough to dig deep enough. We thought she was just being poetic. Eleanor knew? Sarah's voice cracked with the realization that the strange old woman who'd left cryptic letters and hand-drawn maps had been sitting on information that could transform lives and landscapes. "She had to know something," Linda said, consulting a collection of notes and documents she'd retrieved from Eleanor's house. "Look at this. Geological surveys from the 1940s, mineral rights documentation, correspondence with the university about subsurface anomalies. She'd been researching this for decades." The implications were staggering and multiplying faster than Sarah could process them. The underground river solved their water problems. The diamond deposit solved their financial problems. The combination solved problems she hadn't even known she had. The county violations, Marcus's threats, Richard Carlisle's mysterious interest in purchasing worthless farmland. "What do we do now?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would be more complicated than any of them were prepared for. "First thing, we confirm what we found," Jack said, shifting into the practical mode that had made him successful in a business built on geological uncertainties. "I've got equipment that can map the extent of the deposit, estimate the concentration, analyze the quality. That'll take about a week." "Then we contact a mining attorney," Dale added, his farmer's instincts already anticipating the legal complexities that would follow any significant mineral discovery. "Mineral rights, extraction permits, environmental assessments. There's a whole bureaucracy built around this kind of thing." "And then we get rich?" Tommy asked, with 8-year-old directness that cut through the adult complications. Jack laughed, but his expression remained serious. "Rich is a relative, son, but if what I think we found is really down there, your mom won't have to worry about county inspectors or heating bills for a very long time." The celebration was interrupted by the sound of vehicles in the driveway, multiple vehicles, arriving with the purposeful coordination that suggested official business rather than neighborly visits. Through the kitchen window, Sarah could see the white county sedan she'd learned to dread, followed by Richard Carlisle's black SUV and a third vehicle she didn't recognize. "Sarah," Dale said, his voice carrying the urgency of someone who understood rural politics better than she did, You need to be very careful about what you say to these people. Word travels fast in small communities, especially word about money. Janet Reeves from the health department emerged from the county sedan with the same grim efficiency she displayed during the inspection. But this time, she was accompanied by two men in suits who looked like they'd never seen the inside of a barn or the outside of a courthouse. Richard Carlyle climbed out of his SUV with the confident stride of someone who'd been expecting this moment, his expensive overcoat immaculate despite the dust and wind that left everyone else looking disheveled. The third vehicle disgorged two more men, older, wearing Western wear that looked authentic rather than costume, moving with the measured pace of people who were accustomed to being taken seriously without having to demand it. "Mrs. Chen," Janet Reeves called across the farmyard, her voice carrying the authority of someone backed by bureaucratic power. "We need to discuss the status of your compliance timeline." "Mrs. Chen," Richard Carlyle interrupted, moving to intercept her before she could respond to the county officials. "I think you'll find that the offer I discussed yesterday has become significantly more attractive." The older man from the third vehicle approached with the diplomatic patience of someone accustomed to navigating competing interests. "Ma'am, I'm Robert Hayes from the State Department of Natural Resources. We've received reports about potential mineral discoveries on your property. We'd like to discuss the regulatory requirements for any extraction activities." Sarah felt like the center of a storm that had materialized without warning, pulled in directions by forces she didn't understand toward consequences she couldn't predict. Jack Patterson moved beside her, his presence reassuring in the way that expertise becomes protective when amateurs are overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control. "Gentleman, lady," Jack said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who dealt with bureaucrats, speculators, and state officials often enough to know their respective agendas. "Mrs. Chen has been drilling for water access to bring her property into compliance with county requirements. Any other discoveries are incidental to that primary purpose." "Incidental discoveries of significant mineral deposits require immediate reporting to state authorities," Robert Hayes replied, consulting a thick manual that looked like it could strangle small animals. "There are environmental assessments, impact studies, extraction permits." "There are also property rights," interrupted one of the men who'd arrived with Hayes. "I'm attorney Jim Whitmore, representing Midwest Development Partners. My clients have a legitimate interest in purchasing mineral rights from property owners who may not be equipped to handle the complexities of large-scale extraction." The conversation was accelerating beyond Sarah's ability to follow, let alone control. Legal terms and regulatory requirements flew around her like debris in a tornado, each one carrying implications for her family's future that she was too inexperienced to evaluate properly. "Stop," she said, her voice cutting through the professional chatter with the sharpness of desperation. "Just stop. Everyone stop talking for 1 minute." The sudden silence was profound, broken only by the wind through the cottonwood trees and the distant sound of Linda Morrison herding the boys toward the house, away from conversations that had become too complex and too important for children to witness. "This is my land," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength from the simple declaration. "These are my mineral rights. Any water or stones or anything else that comes out of the ground belongs to me and my sons. Is that correct?" Attorney Whitmore started to speak, but Robert Hayes held up a hand. "Mrs. Chen, mineral rights and surface rights can be separate legal entities. You'll need to examine your deed carefully to determine exactly what you own." "The deed is clear," Dale Morrison said, surprising everyone with his intervention. "Eleanor made sure of that when she inherited the property from her husband. Surface and mineral rights were consolidated specifically to prevent exactly this kind of confusion." Sarah felt a rush of gratitude toward the old woman she'd never met, whose foresight had protected them from complications she'd never imagined. Eleanor had been playing a longer game, setting pieces in motion for battles that wouldn't be fought until after she was gone. "In that case," Richard Carlyle said, his voice taking on the smooth persuasion of someone making a final offer, "Mrs. Chen should understand that managing a significant mineral discovery requires expertise and capital that most individuals simply don't possess. My clients can offer immediate financial relief and professional management of extraction operations." "How immediate?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to understand that any offer from Carlyle came with strings attached that would bind her more tightly than county building codes. "We could have a check in your hands by Friday, $50,000 as a signing bonus, plus percentage of all extraction revenues." You'd be financially secure while professionals handle the complicated aspects of mining operations. $50,000. It was more money than Sarah had ever imagined having, enough to solve every immediate problem and create a financial cushion she'd never experienced. It was also, she was beginning to suspect, a fraction of what the mineral rights might actually be worth. What percentage of extraction revenues? Jack asked, his tone suggesting he already suspected the answer wouldn't be favorable. Standard industry rates, Whitmore replied without providing actual numbers. Mrs. Chen would receive compensation commensurate with her investment and risk, while the development company would handle capital expenses, regulatory compliance, and operational management. Which translates to what percentage? Dale Morrison pressed, his farmer's instincts attuned to detecting unfavorable deals disguised as generous offers. The evasion continued for several minutes, a verbal dance that revealed more through what wasn't said than what was. Standard industry rates, it became clear, meant that Sarah would receive a small percentage of profits after the development company had recovered their investment and operational costs. The immediate $50,000 would be structured as an advance against future revenues that might or might not materialize. I need time to think about this, Sarah said, though every adult face around her suggested that time was a luxury she didn't have. Mrs. Chen, Janet Reeves interjected, returning the conversation to the immediate crisis that had brought them together. The county compliance timeline hasn't changed. You still have 18 days to meet health and safety requirements, regardless of any potential mineral discoveries. Actually, Jack said, pulling documents from his truck, the successful completion of water well drilling addresses the primary concern about potable water access. I can provide certification of adequate flow rate and water quality by tomorrow morning. That's one issue resolved, Robert Hayes acknowledged, making notes in his manual. But any significant excavation or mining operation will require comprehensive environmental impact studies, which typically take 6 to 18 months to complete. 6 to 18 months without any revenue from mineral extraction, Whitmore added helpfully, during which time Mrs. Chen will still need to meet ongoing financial obligations for property maintenance, utilities, and family support. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Sarah could accept Carlyle's immediate offer and solve her short-term problems while surrendering long-term wealth. Or she could maintain ownership and spend months navigating bureaucratic requirements while her family struggled with poverty and county inspectors. There's a third option, Dale Morrison said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd reached a difficult decision. Sarah, you don't have to face this alone. There are people in this community who believe in what you're trying to do here. What kind of people? Attorney Whitmore asked with the suspicious tone of someone sensing competition for his client's objectives. The kind who remember when communities supported each other instead of just looking for opportunities to profit from each other's struggles. Linda Morrison replied, emerging from the house with a steaming coffee pot and the determined expression of someone entering a battle. Over the next hour, as the various officials and speculators made their cases and issued their warnings and presented their offers, Sarah began to understand that she was witnessing something larger than a simple business negotiation. This was a conflict between different visions of what rural America could become. Communities built on mutual support versus opportunities for external exploitation. The diamond discovery had attracted attention from outside forces that viewed her farm as a resource to be extracted rather than a home to be protected. But it had also revealed support from neighbors who understood that her success or failure would ultimately impact everyone in the community. By afternoon, when the officials had departed and the speculators had made their final offers, Sarah found herself sitting at Linda Morrison's kitchen table with a collection of documents that would determine her family's future. Contracts from Midwest development partners, regulatory requirements from the state, compliance timelines from the county, and business cards from lawyers who specialized in mineral rights litigation. But she also had something else, a hand-drawn map from Eleanor Hartwell, showing not just the location of underground water, but geological formations that suggested the diamond deposit extended far beyond what Jack had initially discovered. Eleanor's research had been more comprehensive than anyone had realized, documenting decades of subtle signs and geological clues that pointed toward a mineral treasure that could transform the entire county. She knew, Sarah said, studying Eleanor's careful notations about soil composition, seasonal water flow patterns, and unexplained electromagnetic anomalies. She knew exactly what was down there. The question, Dale said, is what you're going to do with what you know now." Sarah looked through the kitchen window toward her own farmhouse, barely visible through the cottonwood trees, where her sons were probably doing homework at Eleanor's kitchen table, trusting her to make decisions that would shape their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. The answer, when it came, surprised her with its clarity. She wasn't going to sell her mineral rights to speculators who viewed her desperation as a business opportunity. She wasn't going to accept charity from well-meaning neighbors who might later resent their generosity. She was going to do exactly what Eleanor had spent decades preparing for someone to do. She was going to fight for the land, dig deep enough to find what it had been waiting to give, and prove that some treasures could only be claimed by those brave enough to invest everything in the search. "I'm going to drill," she said, her voice steady with decision, "all the way down, and I'm going to do it right." The drilling began at dawn on a Tuesday morning that smelled of snow and possibility. Jack Patterson's equipment was more sophisticated this time, not just the standard water well machinery, but geological sampling tools, core extraction devices, and monitoring equipment that could map the underground treasure chamber Eleanor's research had suggested lay beneath their feet. Sarah stood in the pre-dawn darkness, coffee steaming in the October cold, watching Jack's crew prepare for what he'd called the most important hole I've ever drilled in 30 years of poking around in God's basement. The boys pressed against her sides, still in their pajamas and winter coats, their breath visible in small puffs as they whispered questions about what they might find below the frost-hardened ground. "Will it really make us rich, Mom?" James asked with 6-year-old pragmatism that cut straight to the heart of adult complications. "Rich means different things to different people, sweetheart," Sarah replied, though she was beginning to understand that the diamond deposit might redefine their family's relationship with poverty in ways that would take years to fully comprehend. The first day produced water, clean, cold, and flowing, at a rate that exceeded even Jack's optimistic projections. By afternoon, they had established a sustainable well that would solve not just their immediate compliance problems, but provide enough water for the agricultural operations Sarah was still learning to envision. The second day brought the first diamonds. They emerged with the drilling mud, as Jack's equipment pushed past the 200-foot mark Eleanor's maps had identified as the threshold between ordinary geology and underground treasure. Small stones at first, industrial-grade diamonds that caught the morning light without particular brilliance. But as the drill went deeper, the quality improved, and by midday Jack was pulling stones from the mud that sparkled with genuine fire. "Sweet Jesus," he murmured, washing a particularly large stone in a bucket of clean water. The diamond was roughly the size of a marble, clear except for internal fractures that created rainbow patterns when held to the light. "I've never seen anything like this." Word traveled with the speed that news moves in rural communities. Faster than the internet, more reliable than newspapers, carrying details and implications that grew more dramatic with each retelling. By Thursday, Sarah's driveway looked like a parking lot for official vehicles. State geological surveyors, environmental assessment teams, mining engineers, and attorneys representing interests she was still learning to identify. The attention was overwhelming and oddly familiar. This same intense scrutiny she'd experienced during the divorce proceedings, when every aspect of her personal life had been examined by professionals whose job was to identify weaknesses and exploit them for competitive advantage. But this time she wasn't facing the process alone. Dale Morrison had appointed himself her unofficial advisor, screening phone calls and filtering the flood of offers that arrived with each day's mail delivery. Linda Morrison had taken over coordination of the boys' daily routines, ensuring they got to school and back without being overwhelmed by the chaos surrounding their home. Most importantly, Jack Patterson had become her advocate in the technical discussions that would determine how the diamond extraction actually proceeded. His 30 years of drilling experience had given him credibility with state regulators and mining engineers, and his obvious personal investment in the project's success made him a more trustworthy advisor than the consultants who arrived with predetermined agendas and pre-written contracts. "The deposit is bigger than we initially thought," Jack reported after a week of systematic exploration. "Based on core samples and geological mapping, we're looking at a concentrated diamond field that extends across most of your 43 acres. Conservative estimates suggest a yield value in excess of $100 million. $100 million. The number was so large it felt abstract, like astronomical distances or geological timescales, mathematically precise but experientially meaningless. Sarah tried to imagine what $100 million would mean in practical terms, and found her imagination inadequate to the task. "What does that mean for us?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would be more complicated than the simple arithmetic might suggest. "It means you're going to have choices," Jack replied, his tone suggesting that having choices at this level would present its own challenges. "But it also means you're going to have to be very careful about who you trust and how you proceed." The warnings proved prophetic within days, as the initial trickle of interest became a flood of attention from mining companies, investment firms, equipment manufacturers, and legal specialists who descended on Millfield, Nebraska, like prospectors rushing toward a gold strike. Richard Carlisle's initial $50,000 offer was quickly superseded by more sophisticated proposals, partnerships that would provide immediate capital while preserving Sarah's ownership stake, management agreements that would handle extraction and marketing while guaranteeing specific revenue percentages, and outright purchase offers that escalated from hundreds of thousands to millions of dollars. Each offer came with its own team of experts, its own projections and promises, its own vision of how the diamond field should be developed. Sarah found herself sitting through presentations that reminded her of Marcus's business meetings, confident men in expensive suits explaining why their expertise was essential for managing opportunities that ordinary people couldn't navigate successfully. The pressure was constant and exhausting. Representatives from major mining corporations called at all hours, leaving messages that emphasized the time-sensitive nature of their offers and the risks of proceeding without professional management. Attorneys arrived unannounced, producing documents that required immediate signature to secure favorable terms that wouldn't be available indefinitely. Local officials, initially supportive of Sarah's unexpected good fortune, began expressing concerns about the environmental and infrastructure impact of large-scale mining operations. County commissioners worried about increased traffic on roads not designed for heavy equipment. Environmental groups raised questions about groundwater protection and habitat disruption. Community leaders wondered whether an influx of mining workers and outside investment would change the character of their rural area in unwelcome ways. "You're not just making decisions for your family," Janet Reeves explained during what had become weekly meetings about regulatory compliance and environmental oversight. "This discovery will impact every person in the county, every business, every family. That's a significant responsibility." The weight of that responsibility kept Sarah awake through long nights, when the autumn wind rattled the farmhouse windows and carried the scent of approaching winter. She'd bought the farm to escape the consequences of other people's decisions, to create a space where she could control her family's destiny through hard work and stubborn determination. Now she found herself at the center of decisions that would affect hundreds of families and alter the economic landscape of an entire region. The solution, when it came, emerged from an unexpected source: Tommy's third-grade social studies project about community helpers. "Mom," he said one evening while working on a poster about how different jobs contribute to community welfare, "why don't you just hire the helpers instead of selling to them?" The question was so simple it took Sarah a moment to understand its implications. Instead of selling mineral rights or entering partnerships with outside companies, why not maintain ownership and hire the expertise needed to develop the diamond field under her own direction? The idea seemed impossible until Jack Patterson pointed out that it wasn't unprecedented. "Family-owned mining operations exist all over the world," he said, consulting resources Sarah hadn't known existed. Previously, Sarah Chen discovered her Nebraska farmland contained a massive diamond deposit worth over $100 million. Now she faces the challenge of developing it while protecting her family and community. Tommy's innocent question about hiring helpers instead of selling to them sparked something revolutionary in Sarah's exhausted mind. Why surrender control to corporations when she could build her own operation? The concept seemed audacious, until Jack Patterson spread geological surveys across Eleanor's kitchen table and began sketching what a family-owned mining operation might actually look like. "The beautiful thing about this deposit," Jack explained, pointing to core sample data that looked like abstract art to Sarah but apparently told a clear story to someone who understood geology, "is that it's concentrated in shallow formations. We're not talking about deep shaft mining that requires massive industrial infrastructure. This could be developed with selective excavation, careful extraction, and minimal environmental impact." Dale Morrison leaned back in his chair, studying Jack's sketches with the practical eye of someone who'd spent decades evaluating agricultural investments. You're talking about Sarah becoming a mining company. That's not exactly the same as learning to grow soybeans. No, Jack agreed, but it's not as complicated as these corporate vultures want her to believe. Mining is just another form of farming. Instead of harvesting crops from the surface, you're harvesting resources from below ground. The principles are similar. Understand your land, invest in proper equipment, hire good people, and manage your resources sustainably. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself enrolled in an intensive education program that made her divorce proceedings seem simple by comparison. Jack introduced her to mining engineers who specialized in small-scale operations. Dale connected her with agricultural extension agents who understood rural business development. Linda Morrison, demonstrating organizational skills that had been honed by decades of managing farm finances, helped Sarah navigate the bewildering world of permits, licenses, and regulatory compliance. The learning curve was steep, but Sarah discovered she was good at this. But she also discovered something unexpected. She was good at this. The analytical skills that had made her successful in her previous career translated surprisingly well to mining operations. The attention to detail that had frustrated Marcus during their marriage proved invaluable when reviewing environmental impact assessments and equipment specifications. The stubborn determination that had driven her to buy a failed farm with her last $400 now focused on mastering every aspect of an industry she'd never imagined entering. The breakthrough came during a meeting with Dr. Margaret Hoffman, a mining engineer from the Colorado School of Mines who specialized in sustainable extraction methods. Dr. Hoffman was a woman in her 50s who'd spent 30 years developing techniques that maximized resource recovery while minimizing environmental damage. "Mrs. Chen," she said, reviewing geological reports while sipping coffee in the farmhouse kitchen, "you're sitting on something remarkable. Not just the diamonds, though they're certainly impressive. You have what we call an ideal extraction scenario, high-value resources in accessible formations, adequate water supply for processing, and geographical isolation that minimizes community impact. What does that mean in practical terms?" Dr. Hoffman pulled out her laptop and began showing Sarah examples of similar operations around the world. Small-scale diamond mines in Botswana, family-owned gemstone operations in Montana, cooperative mining ventures in Canada. The common thread was local ownership, sustainable practices, and long-term thinking that prioritized community benefit over maximum short-term profit. "It means you can develop this deposit using methods that work with the land rather than against it," Dr. Hoffman explained. "Selective excavation that preserves topsoil and groundwater, processing techniques that minimize waste and environmental impact, marketing strategies that maximize value by targeting collectors and specialty markets, rather than industrial users." The plan that emerged over the winter months was audacious in its scope and conservative in its approach. Sarah would establish Chen Mining Operations as a family-owned business focused on sustainable diamond extraction. The operation would be developed in phases, starting with a pilot project that would prove the concept while generating initial revenue. Phase 1 involved establishing a small-scale operation on 5 acres of the property, using equipment that could be operated by a crew of 6 people working under expert supervision. Dr. Hoffman estimated that this initial operation could produce diamonds worth approximately $2 million per year while Sarah learned the business and refined her techniques. Phase 2 would expand operations to cover 15 acres, employing local residents and generating enough revenue to fund community improvements, better roads, enhanced school facilities, and economic development projects that would benefit everyone in the county. Phase 3 was the ambitious long-term vision, a fully integrated operation that would make Sarah one of the largest independent diamond producers in North America, while maintaining the environmental and community standards that had driven the project from the beginning. The financial projections were staggering. Conservative estimates suggested that Sarah could generate $20 million annually within 5 years, while retaining full ownership of the operation and providing employment for dozens of local residents. More optimistic scenarios projected revenues that would make her one of the wealthiest individuals in Nebraska. But the money Sarah was discovering was just the beginning of the transformation. The first diamonds came out of the ground on a crisp February morning that felt like the first day of spring, despite the snow still covering the winter wheat fields. Sarah stood beside the excavation site, wearing steel-toed boots and a hard hat that Jack Patterson had insisted were non-negotiable safety requirements, watching her crew of 6 local residents carefully process gravel that might contain treasures worth more than most people earned in a lifetime. The crew was an interesting mix of expertise and enthusiasm. Jack Patterson served as operations manager, applying 3 decades of drilling experience to the challenge of selective excavation. Dale Morrison had surprised everyone by demonstrating a natural aptitude for heavy equipment operation, bringing the same methodical precision he applied to farming to the delicate work of diamond extraction. Linda Morrison managed logistics and employee coordination with the organizational skills that had made her the unofficial social director for 3 counties. The other 3 crew members were local residents who'd been struggling with the economic challenges that had been squeezing rural communities for decades. Maria Santos had lost her job at the grain elevator when it was automated the previous year. Robert Kowalski was a young man whose family had lost their farm to bankruptcy and who'd been contemplating leaving Nebraska for opportunities in larger cities. Sarah Peterson was a single mother whose part-time work at the post office barely covered her family's basic expenses. Now they were learning to operate equipment worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, processing material that could contain diamonds worth tens of thousands of dollars, participating in an operation that was generating more economic activity than their community had seen in decades. The first significant diamond emerged on their 3rd day of operation, a clear stone roughly the size of a pea, with internal characteristics that Dr. Hoffman's initial assessment suggested might be worth $15,000 after proper cutting and certification. Sarah held the diamond in her palm, feeling its weight and warmth, trying to comprehend that this small crystal represented more money than she'd earned in her previous job over 6 months. But more than the financial value, the diamond represented proof that Eleanor's vision and Sarah's stubborn faith had been vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. "Not bad for a few days' work," Jack said, grinning with the satisfaction of someone whose professional reputation had been enhanced by the success of an ambitious gamble. "At this rate, we'll hit our first-year revenue projections by summer." The success attracted attention that ranged from supportive to predatory. Local newspapers ran feature stories about the Nebraska Diamond Rush that attracted visitors from across the Midwest. Agricultural extension offices sent representatives to document Sarah's operation as a model for rural economic development. Tourism officials began discussing the potential for developing mining tourism that could bring additional revenue to the county. But success also attracted less welcome attention. Attorneys representing major mining corporations continued to make offers for partnership agreements that would have given Sarah immediate financial security while transferring operational control to entities whose primary loyalty was to shareholders rather than communities. Environmental groups raised questions about the long-term impact of mining operations on groundwater and wildlife habitat, despite Dr. Hoffman's careful environmental monitoring that showed minimal ecological disruption. Most challenging were the federal investigators who arrived without warning on a Tuesday morning in March, wearing suits that looked expensive and carrying briefcases that suggested serious legal complications. Mrs. Chen, the lead investigator, introduced himself. "I'm Agent Michael Torres with the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. We need to discuss your recent business activities." Sarah's stomach dropped as she recognized the tone and demeanor she'd experienced during the worst moments of her divorce proceedings, official authority backed by the power to destroy lives through bureaucratic mechanisms that ordinary citizens couldn't navigate or challenge effectively. The investigation focused on what Agent Torres described as, quote, unusual financial transactions that have attracted regulatory attention. Sarah's rapid transition from near poverty to significant wealth had triggered automated monitoring systems designed to detect money laundering, tax evasion, and other financial crimes. The fact that her newfound wealth came from diamond mining, an industry often associated with international criminal enterprises, had intensified official scrutiny. The investigators wanted detailed documentation of every transaction, every business relationship, every decision that had led to her current financial situation. "Agent Torres," Sarah said, trying to project confidence she didn't feel, "everything we've done has been legal, documented, and conducted in full compliance with all applicable regulations. We have permits for mining operations, environmental compliance certifications, and detailed financial records for every transaction." "I'm sure that's correct, Mrs. Chen. But unusual wealth generation in rural areas, often involves activities that aren't immediately apparent to local regulatory authorities. We need to verify that your operation doesn't include any undisclosed revenue sources. The implication was clear. They suspected her of criminal activity that extended beyond simple diamond mining. The investigation would involve forensic accounting, business record analysis, and scrutiny that could disrupt her operations for months, while government officials satisfied themselves that she wasn't engaged in sophisticated criminal enterprises. The solution came from an unexpected source: Dr. Hoffman's connections within the mining industry and regulatory community. Her 30 years of experience had given her relationships with officials who understood the difference between legitimate mining operations and the kind of criminal enterprises that Agent Torres was trained to investigate. Within a week, Dr. Hoffman had arranged for Sarah to be visited by representatives from the Mining Industry Association, the Department of the Interior, and the Small Business Administration, officials whose job was to support legitimate mining operations rather than prosecute them. The endorsement from recognized industry experts effectively ended the criminal investigation, while establishing Sarah's operation as a model for sustainable rural development. Agent Torres departed with the disappointed expression of someone whose suspicions had been professionally contradicted by people whose expertise he was required to respect. But the investigation had served one positive purpose. It forced Sarah to develop the kind of comprehensive documentation and regulatory compliance systems that would protect her operation from future scrutiny while establishing her credibility within the mining industry. By late spring, Chen mining operations was generating revenue that exceeded Sarah's most optimistic projections. The pilot operation was producing diamonds at a rate that translated to approximately $3 million annually, 50% higher than Dr. Hoffman's conservative estimates. The operation transformed the entire community, providing jobs and hope to families who'd been struggling for years. The success had attracted attention from universities, government agencies, and international mining organizations interested in studying Sarah's operation as a model for sustainable resource development. Delegations of officials from developing countries visited the farm to learn techniques that might be applicable to their own mining industries. But success also brought pressure to expand faster than Sarah was comfortable with. Venture capital firms offered tens of millions of dollars for partnership agreements that would accelerate development while diluting her control over operations. Equipment manufacturers provided favorable financing for machinery that would triple production capacity. Marketing specialists proposed distribution agreements with international diamond dealers that could increase revenues dramatically. Each opportunity represented a choice between maintaining the careful, sustainable approach that had brought them this far versus embracing rapid growth that might compromise the values that had driven the project from the beginning. The decision point came during a family meeting that included not just Sarah and her sons, but the extended community family that had formed around the mining operation. Gathered around Eleanor's kitchen table, now expanded with additional chairs to accommodate everyone, were Jack Patterson, Dale and Linda Morrison, Dr. Hoffman, and the core crew members whose lives had been transformed by the project. "We need to decide what kind of operation we want to be," Sarah said, reviewing proposals that covered the table like a paper landscape of possibilities. "We can stay small and sustainable, maintaining local control while generating steady income for everyone involved. Or we can expand rapidly, accepting outside investment that would make us all wealthy, but might change the character of what we've built here." Tommy, now 9 years old and possessing the practical wisdom that came from watching adults navigate complex decisions, asked the question that cut through all the financial projections and growth strategies. "Mom, if we get bigger, will we still be the same family we are now?" The question silenced the room with its clarity. The mining operation had become more than a business. It was a community experiment in economic democracy, environmental responsibility, and the kind of mutual support that rural areas needed to survive in an increasingly centralized economy. "That's the real question," Dale Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent decades watching communities succeed or fail based on the choices they made about growth and change. "We've created something here that works for everyone involved. The question is whether we can maintain that as we get bigger." Dr. Hoffman, who had advised mining operations around the world, offered her perspective. "In my experience, the operations that maintain their values over time are the ones that grow slowly, maintain local control, and never forget that the purpose of business is to serve communities rather than the other way around." The discussion continued for hours, covering financial projections, environmental impact assessments, community development goals, and the kind of legacy they wanted to leave for future generations. By evening, they'd reached a consensus that surprised Sarah with its maturity and long-term thinking. They would expand, but gradually and sustainably. Chen mining operations would develop Phase 2 of the operation over the next 3 years, creating additional employment while maintaining environmental and community standards. Profits would be reinvested in community infrastructure, better schools, improved healthcare facilities, and economic development projects that would benefit everyone in the county. Profit structure. Most importantly, they would establish the Chen Foundation, a nonprofit organization that would ensure long-term community benefit from the mining operation. The foundation would fund education, environmental conservation, and economic development projects throughout rural Nebraska, using diamond wealth to address the challenges facing agricultural communities across the Midwest. 5 years after Sarah Chen had climbed the cracked courthouse steps, with her last $400 and a deed to abandoned farmland, she stood in the same courthouse as the guest of honor at a ceremony recognizing her contribution to rural economic development. The transformation was remarkable, not just in her personal circumstances, though the financial security was still occasionally surreal, but in the ripple effects that had spread throughout the county and beyond. Millfield School District had been expanded and modernized with funding from the Chen Foundation, attracting young families who'd previously moved to urban areas for better educational opportunities. The hospital had added a new wing focused on rural healthcare, making specialized medical services available within the community for the first time in decades. The success of Chen mining operations had inspired other landowners to explore their own properties for mineral deposits, leading to the discovery of additional diamond formations and the development of what geologists now called the Nebraska Diamond Field, a mineral region that was generating international attention and scientific research. Most importantly, the project had demonstrated that rural communities could control their own economic destiny through careful planning, environmental responsibility, and the kind of cooperative effort that had once been common in agricultural areas but had been largely abandoned in favor of corporate agriculture and external investment. Tommy and James, now teenagers, had grown up understanding that wealth came with responsibility to the community that had made it possible. They'd participated in foundation activities, learned about sustainable business practices, and developed the kind of environmental consciousness that would guide their own adult decisions. During the ceremony, Sarah was invited to speak about the lessons she'd learned from transforming failed farmland into sustainable mining operations. Her remarks were brief, but profound. 5 years ago, I thought I was buying land to escape from problems I couldn't solve. I discovered that I was actually buying an opportunity to solve problems I'd never imagined. The real treasure wasn't the diamonds in the ground. It was the community of people who were willing to work together to dig deep enough to find them. The speech was recorded and would later be shared with rural development organizations, mining industry associations, and community groups around the world as an example of what was possible when ordinary people were brave enough to believe in extraordinary possibilities. But for Sarah, the most meaningful moment came after the ceremony, when she returned to the farmhouse where Eleanor Hartwell had spent 50 years believing that the land would eventually provide for whoever was patient enough to listen to its secrets. She found Eleanor's final letter in the kitchen drawer where she'd kept it as a reminder during the darkest moments of uncertainty. The careful cursive looked the same, but the words carried deeper meaning after years of experience. The land will provide if you prove you're worthy of its gifts. Sarah understood now that worthiness hadn't been measured by her ability to extract maximum profit from mineral resources, but by her commitment to using those resources in ways that honored the land and served the community. Eleanor had been preparing not just for someone to discover the diamonds, but for someone who would discover them responsibly. As she prepared dinner for her sons in the kitchen where her transformation had begun, Sarah reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them from near homelessness to financial security, from isolation to community leadership, from desperation to hope. The diamond mine continued operating according to the sustainable principles they'd established, generating steady income while maintaining environmental standards that had become a model for the industry. The Chen Foundation supported projects throughout rural Nebraska, addressing challenges that extended far beyond their own county. The community that had formed around the mining operation continued to demonstrate that economic development could strengthen rather than disrupt traditional rural values. But the most important transformation was in Sarah herself, from someone who'd seen herself as a victim of circumstances beyond her control to someone who understood that the most valuable treasures were often buried beneath the surface, waiting for people brave enough to dig deep enough to find them. The evening ended with a family tradition that had developed over the years, reading Eleanor's letters and studying her maps by lamplight, searching for additional clues about secrets that might still be hidden in the Nebraska soil. Tommy and James had inherited their mother's determination and Eleanor's faith that the land held more treasures than any single generation could discover. Sometimes, Sarah thought as she watched her sons plan their own future explorations, the greatest gift you can give your children isn't wealth or security, but the knowledge that extraordinary possibilities exist for those who are willing to work hard enough and dig deep enough to find them. The story had come full circle, from desperate beginnings to remarkable success, but Sarah understood that it wasn't really an ending. It was a beginning. For her sons, for their community, and for anyone who might hear their story and decide to take their own leap of faith into the unknown soil of possibility. 10 years later, the Nebraska Diamond Field had become an internationally recognized mining region, generating hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue while maintaining the environmental and community standards that Sarah had established with her original operation. Tommy Chen, now studying geological engineering at the Colorado School of Mines, was preparing to return home and take over day-to-day operations of the family business. James, interested in environmental law, was planning to focus his career on developing legal frameworks that would protect rural communities from exploitative mining practices. The Chen Foundation had grown into one of the largest rural development organizations in the Midwest, funding projects that addressed everything from agricultural sustainability to renewable energy development. Dr. Margaret Hoffman, now in her 60s, served as the Foundation's chief scientific advisor, ensuring that all funded projects met the same standards of environmental responsibility that had guided the original mining operation. Dale and Linda Morrison, now in their 70s, continued to live on their family farm, but had also become community leaders whose advice was sought by rural development organizations throughout the country. Their example of neighborly support and community investment had become a model for the kind of mutual aid that could help rural areas thrive in an increasingly complex economy. Jack Patterson had expanded his drilling business into a full-service geological consulting firm, helping other rural landowners explore their properties for mineral resources, while maintaining the sustainable practices he'd developed working with Sarah. Most importantly, the success had attracted a new generation of young families to the area. Farmers, entrepreneurs, teachers, and professionals who were drawn by the combination of economic opportunity and community values that the diamond discovery had made possible. The courthouse where Sarah's journey had begun now featured a historical marker commemorating the discovery that had transformed the county's economy and demonstrated that rural communities could control their own economic destiny through careful planning and cooperative effort. But for those who understood the full story, the real monument wasn't the marker or the successful mining operation or even the hundreds of jobs that had been created. The real monument was the proof that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things when they were brave enough to believe in possibilities that others dismissed as impossible. Eleanor Hartwell's vision had been vindicated in ways she probably never imagined, but exactly as she had hoped. The land had indeed provided for those who proved themselves worthy of its gifts, not through exploitation, but through the kind of patient, respectful stewardship that recognized wealth as a responsibility, rather than just an opportunity. The diamonds continued to emerge from the Nebraska soil, but the most valuable treasure had already been discovered: the knowledge that communities could take control of their own futures, and that the most extraordinary transformations often began with the simplest acts of faith. Thank you for joining us on Sarah's incredible journey from desperation to triumph. Her story proves that sometimes the greatest treasures are hidden beneath our feet, waiting for someone brave enough to dig deep and believe in the impossible. If you enjoyed this amazing tale of courage, determination, and hidden treasure, please subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of ordinary people who achieved extraordinary things. Thumbs up. Like this video if Sarah's story touched your heart and reminded you that success often comes to those who refuse to give up, even when everyone else has stopped believing. Speech balloon, comment below and tell us, what impossible dream are you brave enough to pursue? Your story of determination might inspire our next video. Anti-clockwise arrows. Share this story with someone who needs a reminder that their current struggles might be preparing them for their greatest success. Subscribe now and ring the notification bell so you never miss our stories of hope, determination, and the incredible things that happen when ordinary people refuse to accept ordinary limitations. See you in the next story, treasure hunters. Sparkles.